I think if I was in charge of the campaign on the Russian side, I would be extremely worried right now.
What is your biggest worry right now when you look at the stranglehold on Mariupol, Navy ships standing off with possible amphibious landings that have been predicted for 2 weeks now on places like Odessa, troops amassing outside of Kiev, the constant relentless barrage of Kharkiv? Take your pick, Ben. But I mean, what is kind of top on your list for the next chapter in this bloody conflict?
Well, the worst thing, of course, is the murder of civilians. I mean, this is just so gut wrenching. We hosted a couple of Ukrainian refugees just the other day. I mean, people are a bunch of them were on the train with me from Berlin to Frankfurt the other night, and these are the ones that have made it all the way through Poland and are coming to Germany. And it's amazing to see how Europe is welcoming, receiving these people, these refugees that have lost so much.
Right, and that's 2 million out of there's still 42 million people in that country.
So it's really been an amazing thing to watch, but it's gut wrenching when you know what's caused them to leave. And so the thing that I think is in the front of my mind is how do we stop that? The second thing, though, would be can we keep the alliance together? I mean, that's been the one of the most important aspects of this is all 30 nations sticking together in their condemnation of Russia. More than 20 nations are involved in the delivery of logistics and weapons and equipment into Ukraine. This is a huge effort, and I think the administration deserves a lot of credit for that. But that's not for free, and it's not going to last forever. And so the administration has to continue working on that to continue the support for Ukraine. And look, I acknowledge.
Is the clock ticking on that? If you don't mind me jumping in, is the clock ticking on that when you take a look at the politics of, France has a looming presidential election, the U.S. has got midterms. There's right now countries have come together and NATO is standing strong, but do you worry about the politics, the domestic politics of each of these countries as this conflict drags on? Do people become firmer in their convictions, or do they wobble and waver?
I think the clock is ticking faster on the Kremlin than it is on us. I mean, as sanctions, the effect of sanctions is not even really hitting yet in most places, other than loss of services. So the sanctions are really going to start taking effect in the coming weeks in Russia, and so I think the Kremlin, sees that. They see their manpower problem, their logistical problems. They don't have endless amounts of time, and the Ukrainian side is getting stronger. You're right, of course, there will be lots of other issues that will begin to dominate domestic scene in the U.S. and France and in other places because these sanctions are two-edged in many cases. But on the plus side, we're already in the middle of March. I mean, most of the winter is behind us. So the threat of loss of gas for heating becomes a little bit less severe. I think that as long as we stick together, and it's easy to say, harder to do, but the president has made this such a priority that I feel confident we will. Now, also, let me be clear. The no-fly zone is something that will be hugely debated. Most nations have already said, no way. But a week from now, as we watch apartment buildings collapse on top of civilians and so-called humanitarian corridors are attacked by the Russians, as we continue to see this, the pressure is going to be immense. And so I'm not saying that we should just drive on, disregard the risk of an escalation. What I'm saying is we've got to find a way to stop the murder of civilians.
Why do you think that the U.S. didn't accept Poland's offer to supply 30 Soviet era MiGs to the Ukrainians by passing them through Ramstein Air Base to the Americans, who would then pass them on to the Ukrainians. I mean, they didn't have to be flown on missions from Ramstein, and I assume there were operating air bases inside of Ukraine that the Ukrainians could then take those MiGs. They have the pilots with some short training involved to adapt to the Polish MiGs. They could be up airborne, protecting their own skies. I mean, it sounded like a very reasonable offer.
I think on its face, it is. And probably you've got the right people working on how do you make this happen. But look, there's probably, and again, I don't have inside information on this. I'm anxious to find out. I'm trying to read everything that's out there.
In fact, Secretary Blinken had given his initial sort of blessing on this idea over the weekend.
No, that's not true. That's not true. What he said was they're actively seeking ways to do this. That's not like it's going to happen. I think what he was describing is the process where you take into account how could we make this happen? What would be required?
I think he said on Face the Nation on the weekend on CBS that he had given a green light.
Okay, well, that's not just a State Department decision. Look, one of the factors, and I hope it happens, by the way, I hope it happens, but you've got to have take into consideration, if Poland gives up a significant amount of their air force, no matter how good the cause, if that's not backfilled, the Poles have a healthy respect for the possibility that Russia would launch strikes against Polish air bases. Okay, so I think before Poland uncovers itself, they would need to have some sort of understanding that they would be protected.
They would get replacement aircraft, whether they be F-16s or whatever they be. And then there's also commitments to Taiwan, apparently of F-16 commitments. So I understand it's a detailed, complicated discussion, but in principle, it's a heck of a lot easier to bring about a flying Ukrainian defense of its own skies than it is to draw NATO into a no-fly zone.
I would hope that this comes about. Of course, there are several different flavors of F-16, different cockpits, depending on where they would come from. It's not like hopping in a rental car. I know you know that. I think the right people are involved in trying to think through how do we make this happen. I would be very disappointed, though, if this was held up even 1 hour because somebody inside the White House staff was grumpy with the Poles because the Poles publicly put this out before the administration did, or because there was anything other than just working through the mechanics of how do we do this. But I think people in the department and the Joint Staff could be forgiven for thinking, all right, wait a minute, before we uncover Poland, we got to make sure that part's done too. This is not just an isolated thing. It's part of a much bigger picture. And you're right, we don't have unlimited, airplanes that are ready to fly that are just sitting around waiting for missions and pilots.
Last word to you, Ben. Forward thinking on where we go, and I appreciate your time.
This is worth fighting for. I mean, what we're doing is so important. It's about the lives of innocent people. It's about all the values that we claim to stand up and represent. I think the whole world has been inspired by President Zelensky and by the Ukrainian people, much the way most of us were inspired by the resistance of Great Britain during the early days of World War II. And I think that I am annoyed is not the right word. I get frustrated when good, well-meaning people say, well, that's never going to happen, or we can't do that. So, well, wait a minute. Maybe we can. Maybe there are ways to do things to help Ukraine defend itself rather than just discounting, well, we'll never do a no-fly zone, or we'll never have U.S. boots on the ground, or we're never going to do this. There's a lot of stuff we can do to force the Kremlin to start looking over their shoulder. I would love to see a big, gigantic snap exercise in Georgia, for example. I mean, have paratroopers jump in there. Well, we've done that many times before, and cause the Russians to remind them that because they're taking their troops from all over Russia to put them into Ukraine, they have vulnerable flanks. Or maybe it's time for a nice Navy exercise up in the North Atlantic towards the Arctic. Or maybe it's time for a naval quarantine of the Russian Navy base in Tartus, Syria. Not a blockade, that's an act of war, but a quarantine. Things to remind the Russians of how vulnerable they are and how much more reach we have than they do. And I think that Turkey has more to do. I think that Germany has more to do. There are many options for us, but at the end of the day, I don't want us standing around saying, I can't believe we didn't do something to prevent the murder of thousands of Ukrainian civilians.
Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, thank you, Ben.
Thank you.